Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we have a great program for you this afternoon featuring two New York Times reporters, Russ Buettner and Susanne Craig, who've written one of the most talked about books at the moment, Lucky Loser: How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. The story they tell peels away layer after layer that Trump has built up over the years to foster the what turns out to be a fallacious image of himself as a self-made business success. The book explores the substantial help Trump received early on from his dad, Trump projects that never came to fruition or faltered badly, his inflated assertions about his own wealth, his overspending, his financial chicanery. It also examines the critical role the media has played in promoting the myth of Trump, most notably the scripted reality show, The Apprentice, that made him a star and afforded lots of endorsement and licensing deals. Now, of course, there's no shortage of Trump books, books about his past and his presidency. But as a New York Times review of Lucky Loser said, this is one of those rare Trump books that deserve, even demand, to be read. And Russ and Susanne are the ideal authors to have written this book after 8 years now that they've been looking into Trump's business dealings and financial records. It was their articles in the Times, reported with David Barstow, articles that authoritatively debunked Trump's claims of self-made wealth and revealed an empire riddled with tax dodges. Those articles won the Pulitzer for explanatory journalism in 2019. Russ has worked at the Times since 2006 and previously worked on investigation teams at the Daily News in New York and New York Newsday. Susanne was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal and the Globe and Mail, Canada's national paper. She's Canadian, before joining the Times in 2010. Their book expands considerably on their prize-winning reporting and through the sheer accumulation of evidence punctures the hype that has enveloped Trump. Quote, "The secret of Trump's life," Russ and Susanne write in the introduction, "one that emerges in hundreds of moments, big and small, is that the less he has been involved in decision-making, the better his chances of financial success." So no doubt we're in for a fascinating discussion this afternoon, and moderating that discussion will be another prominent New York Times journalist, Peter Baker, who's the paper's, there's some applause for Peter there. Peter happens to, it seems like he moderates a P&P event like every other week. That is when he and his wife Susan are not coming out with a book of their own. Anyway, he's the paper's chief White House correspondent and has covered 5 presidents, including Trump. He and his wife Susan Glasser wrote a book about the Trump presidency. They've also co-written books on Vladimir Putin's early years in power and James Baker's life. And Peter has authored additional works on Bill Clinton's impeachment, on George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, and on Barack Obama. So please join me in welcoming Russ, Susanne, and Peter.
Well, hello. How's everybody doing? Yeah? Okay, you must really want to see about this book because you're inside on a beautiful fall day. But I think it's a great sign for Russ and Susanne, who produced a fantastic book. Brad is right that there are a lot of Trump books out there. Fair enough. In fact, I think I've read all of them. I counted today, 150 Trump books. Oh, wow. I read them so you don't have to. But the truth is, this is at the top of the list. It really absolutely is. Of all the books that are out there about Trump, this is one I think people really ought to read because it's not only, it builds on the work that Russ and Susanne did at the Times in real time during his presidency, but it goes so much deeper. It's so much more revelatory. It really is, in some ways, the best book you could ever read about Donald Trump to understand who he was before he got to the presidency and why he is who he is today. So I really hope you all will make sure to not just buy one for yourselves, buy one for your cousins, your friends, your your aunts, your uncles, people,
Family pack.
people in red states, people in blue states, whatever. We're gonna have a conversation, as Brad said, for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to questions. And there's a microphone right there, so make sure you start thinking about your question. Let's just start with this. You name your book Lucky Loser, which is going to drive Trump crazy. Why did you pick that title? What are you trying to say with that title?
I think what we were trying to capture is the big arc of this story over the decades, which is this cycle of him coming into huge sums of money and the support of his father in 3 big tranches. First from his father, then also from The Apprentice and all the licensing deals of that, and then from this investment that he got pushed into in a couple of commercial buildings. And those businesses really subsidized a pattern of business failure, right? A lot of the businesses he ran, everybody knows about the casinos in the 1980s, or a lot of people do. He bought a hotel, spent way too much on it, and that thing all collapsed basically under the weight of the decisions he had made. And after he came into The Apprentice money, he did the same thing all over again, and we can go into depth about that. He decided to try to build a tower in Chicago. He said it was going to be a huge success while secretly declaring it completely worthless on his tax returns. He remodeled here the old post office into the hotel. It was beautiful. He always makes things beautiful, but he spends too much. He spent more than $200 million, which all of his competitors bidding on that project thought was ridiculous. And then he spent a little more than that. Then every year he had to pump $7 to $10 million into it to keep it open. That's why we think he sold it. So over the arc of this 50-year career of his in business, Lucky Loser, we think, captures those big cycles and how he used that money to create, again, the illusion that he was successful and that he was a big-time business person.
Yeah, do you want to add anything to that?
No, and I think, Russ, the title really did just come to us. We've been doing this for a long time, and Russ has been referring to him as a lucky loser for quite a while. And when we suggested it we never know you're suggesting a title. It's like newspaper reporters trying to suggest a headline. It doesn't always go over well with the editor, but our publisher said, that's it. So.
Well, that's great, actually. That almost never happens. That's
Yeah, I know.
I think, to be able to do that. But that's fantastic. Are you able to hear in the back, everybody? I just want to make sure we're holding up the microphones enough. I actually made a list from your book. It kind of reminded me of that, what you just said. I mean, the Trump shuttle, failure. Trump USFL team, failure. Television City, a failure. Trump Plaza Casino and Hotel. Trump Taj Mahal, Trump Marina Hotel Casino. Trump Mortgage, Trump Tower, Chicago. They're all failures.
Trump
right?
Water.
Trump
There's a lot.
Water, Trump Ties.
We could do the whole half hour.
Stakes, right? You reported that he reported $1.5 billion, 1.5, that's with a B, $1.5 billion in losses over 2 years. So why is it then we think of him as a great businessman? I mean, he's littered with failures and bankruptcies, and yet he has this image, and is a strong image, of being this remarkably successful businessman.
Right. I mean, I would break it up into 2 pieces and look back, first of all, at his career in the early 1970s when he's first getting started. And we start to see articles about him almost immediately after he's joined his father's company. And at this point, he's getting a salary of about $100,000. It's a great salary at the Trump organization. But we start to see stories in publications, including like the New York Times, that says he's worth $200 million. He's at that point appropriating his father's wealth. And those sort of numbers, and they grow into $1 billion and more as we go through time, go unchallenged. 60 Minutes had a show called Meet the Billionaire, and completely unchallenged that's what it was. He started to get onto the lists of the richest people in the world. And the Trump Organization is a small company. It's privately held. You know, I worked at the Wall Street Journal for years, and we covered publicly traded companies, and every quarter they would report in. We would know what they made, what they lost. Only Trump checked Trump for a lot of years, and that started it. And then he also, I think, really came into a time in the 1980s where he identified television, and Russ and I call it wealth porn, shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. He would be losing money, and we can see that through the tax information that we got on him, but he had the accoutrements of wealth. He had the yachts, he had, gold-plated everything, he had helicopters and planes, and he was able to get on shows. Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous is one that we spend a bit of time on the book looking at, but he was able to get on those shows because he had the accoutrements of wealth and he made for good TV. A lot of really rich people didn't want to be on that show, but Donald Trump really wanted to be on that show. But then I think we really have to have a long conversation about The Apprentice, because it was so important, and a lot of the book is focused on The Apprentice and just how that, first of all, came about, but how it remade his image. And everybody's heard that, but we really try to go inside exactly both the money of it and the person that skilled editors on Mark Burnett's team made, and the money that came from that. It really was sometimes a second inheritance. He made hundreds of millions of dollars from that show. And you don't think a TV producer or a TV host is going to make $50,000, $100,000 an episode to host it. But he struck a deal with Mark Burnett where he got half of the product placement money that those corporations were paying to be on the show. And then he just had so many licensing deals. And Mark Burnett remade him in an editing bay. He wasn't the businessman that you saw on TV, but it sold, and it was reality TV in quotation marks, and a lot of Americans still believe it today.
Can I add a couple things
Please,
to that?
yes, please.
I mean, I think that Sue captured an awful lot there, but I think there's also maybe two other things that are parallel to that. One is we shouldn't neglect that this was a lifelong campaign by Donald Trump to look that way. His father was a very circumspect businessman. He announced projects when he had the financing, the land, and the permits. And he was ready to go, and he was ready to have people start signing leases. That's why he announced. Donald Trump, as soon as he joins his father's company, starts announcing projects that they have nothing on. One of the earliest things he said was, we bought this land on the waterfront in Brooklyn, and we're going to have a shopping mall and big residential towers there, and we own it. They didn't own it. Fred had taken out an option on it, and they didn't close on the option, and Donald said we had signed major retailers, and that wasn't true. And that was just the start of it. He was in the papers constantly saying he was going to build the tallest building in the world. That happened repeatedly. He was going to build a new ferry terminal with office buildings in Lower Manhattan. That just kept going, and I think it really reached both its high point and low point in the late 80s when he started using that reputation he had built as he was in the papers all the time saying, I'm building stuff, I'm making stuff. And it seemed real, even though it wasn't. And I think he realized nobody came back to say, hey, that never happened, right? So in the late 80s, he started saying, I'm going to buy American Airlines. And the stock would go up. And he had bought some stock the day before he made the announcement. And the day after, when the stock went up, he would sell it. But he would keep saying, I'm going to buy American Airlines. And then it would just stop. And that happened with Holiday Inn. It happened with a number of big corporations, and it really affected their stock price and their balance sheets and negatively. In the end, Wall Street finally figured out after several years that it was all a ruse, and he made one more big bet, and he lost almost everything he had made on it. Yeah. But that's power, right? That he had figured out that those lies were powerful. And I think the second part of it is that the way that we as a society confer expertise on people, if someone looks wealthy, and probably if they look white, we sort of assume that whatever they say they're good at, they're actually good at. And we're hesitant to question what they're saying. And it's really hard in this case, as Sue said, to do that. And I think he tends to, in all things, use society's better impulses against us.
Two other things. One of the things that just came to mind was also he had no hesitation in lying, and we found, just looking at you mentioned some of the stocks. He told the Wall Street Journal, other publications, that he had sold all his stock before the stock market crashed. He hadn't, and we could see that later through his financial records that we got. But I also want to say, and we explore this in the book, and it's important, there were journalists who, along the way, called him out on things. Wayne Barrett is one that comes to mind, Tim O'Brien. A character in the book is Neil Barsky, who was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and he very publicly wrote a number of stories about seeing right through Trump's finances. And Trump came for him, and he ended up getting moved off of the beat after a lot of tension between Trump and the Wall Street Journal and Neil. When reporters did question him, the wrath came down on them. And those are characters in the book, and I just want to acknowledge them, because it's not like all of this went unquestioned. People did question it, but there was fallout when they did from Trump.
Well, you did such a great job of showing the difference between perception and reality, right? The reality that he tried to create as an illusion, right? The great example from even when he was in high school, you reveal that at the New York Military Academy, when he gets his class picture taken, he borrows a shirt from a classmate who has lots of medals on it, which his shirt would not have, and he wore it for the class picture, right?
Right, and these aren't medals for valor. They're medals because somebody made their bed well. Like this is not this was what was so unbelievable. And Michael Scadron, I found this fellow. He was a friend of Donald's at the military academy, and Donald went into his room before picture day in the fall of graduation, and Donald saw he had more medals, and he said, "Can I wear your jacket?" And it turns out that jacket only appeared once in the yearbook because Michael Scadron was expelled for beating a classmate. It was a really upsetting story, but one of the cadets insulted his father with a Jewish slur, and Michael got so mad he had a broomstick with a chain tied to it, and he used to use it as sort of a Ben-Hur figure around the academy, and he beat the cadet within an inch of his life. And was expelled. And it was interesting, though, that later, I don't think Donald Trump, by what we could tell, kept in touch with very many people from the New York Military Academy, but he did keep in touch with Michael Scadron. And that was a really early, I think, just an example to us of how Donald Trump has in his circle and with people who have a penchant for violence, that he confers admiration on them.
You have the great example in there that the year he publishes The Art of the Deal, which is holding him out to be this fantastic businessman. According to the tax returns you all obtained, he lost $45 million, right? The year of his, in fact, the zenith of his career, arguably, as a successful businessman. In fact, he's a loser, right? As you say, though, eventually Wall Street catches on, eventually the bank. But why do the banks throw so much money in for so long? They had to have known better. And yet, every time he came back to them, he would bully them, he would finagle them. What's going on with the banks there?
Well, early on, the banks gave him money because he was showing up with his father's chief financier. There was a man named Conrad Stevenson who had lined up all of Fred Trump's biggest loans. Fred walked Donny Boy in there and said, back his projects. And that's how he got financing for the first couple of projects. I think the late 1980s are hard to explain. It was a period of exceptionally free lending, and that was combined with a guy who believed if a bank would give him money for it, it meant it was worth whatever the bank was going to give him, and so his balance sheets were just kind of a wreck. He spent more on the Taj Mahal Casino in Atlantic City than anybody had ever spent there before. The analysts warned him that you already have 2 casinos there. There's too many casinos there already. Your casinos are going to devour each other. Donald Trump, using his powers at that point, got that analyst fired, then later had to pay him in a lawsuit to settle disparaging him. But when that casino opened, the analyst was proven exactly right. He said he was going to have to do $1 million a day, and that was not doable. And Donald Trump started declaring bankruptcy within 6 months of that. So that is really hard to explain. And that was also the junk bond market as well. So some of it's banks, some of it's junk bonds, and it's a complex period to try to find the rational line through on it, I think.
No, I agree. And a lot of it was those junk bonds, high yield debt, and it was just crushing them. But he kept getting it. It was those were the days. I've read so many books on that era, the Michael Milken days and the Predator's Ball, and it was freewheeling times. And he had the luck of falling into that.
Well, part of it too, of course, is he is, as Brad referenced, inflating his own value. He's basically, in effect, arguably lying or certainly deceiving his lenders. He's now, of course, been found liable for that in a civil case in New York, $450 million, I think he's been ordered to pay. But you all have so many great examples of this. You all write that his family valued buildings that were given to him and to the kids, right? For tax purposes, they value them low, and for high purposes, high for other purposes. So a $10 million tax bill becomes a $700,000 tax bill, and a $900 million real estate empire is valued as $57 million for the purposes of taxes, and they even sold themselves supplies to get out of gift taxes, right?
That's an incredible story. That
Story.
one.
I mean, like, so a lot of this is in fact dishonest, right? I mean, or just normal in business, and we're just shocked by it.
I think you see some of, when you talk about valuations, we talk to a lot of experts who said, when you go to the IRS, there is some leeway. What we were told in analyzing this, and when we talked to experts, is that the Trumps just pushed it to the limit and beyond. And I think that that's sort of where I fall when I think about a lot of that. And the fraud issue you mentioned was, when we discovered it, it was just remarkable what they had done. Fred Trump, during his life, he accumulated a huge amount of cash. Unlike Donald, he sort of believed cash was king. He didn't take on debt. And he was getting older, and he was facing a situation where if he had died, there would be a estate tax at the time of roughly 50%. And so there was a scheme concocted in the early 1990s where, Fred Trump owned all these buildings, and he had to buy stuff for the buildings. You think you got to get boilers, you got to buy paint, all the supplies you could imagine. And he would just go to a supplier, not like quite Home Depot, but he had his guy out in Long Island that he would buy stuff from. And all of a sudden, a company is created. It was called All County. And all of a sudden, All County started buying all of the supplies for Fred Trump's buildings. And All County was created by Donald Trump and his siblings. And what they would do is they would buy the supplies, and then they would sell them to Fred at a markup, and they would pocket the difference. And we found out about this. It was fraud. We called it fraud on the front page of the New York Times. But of course, the statute of limitations is told on that for the IRS a long time ago. There are civil suits now going on about it. But that's the sort of stuff that we found over, on multiple.
You found, and remember, these tax records had been litigated for years and years and years. Congress tried to get them, lawyers tried to get them, and these guys are the guys who got them. And you found that there were years where he paid no taxes, or maybe just $750 in actual. How many of us pay more than $750 a year in federal taxes? I think probably most of us. You wrote at one point he at one point collected $90 million in refunds from the IRS for reported losses. So as you write, Trump essentially collected more than $90 million for failing, and yet he was flying around in a helicopter and had gold-lined, fixtures in his apartment and his own plane and all those homes and so forth. So the question, I guess, really comes down for a lot of people is, did he cheat? Or is this just the way the system works, and that rich people can do this and stay within the law, but the law is written in such a way that, they can get away with it?
I think both those things are true. He definitely did cheat. Sue mentioned one of the greatest examples, this setting up a shell corporation to create a phony business.
Would that be illegal if it weren't a statute of limitations?
We were told that would be a prosecutable offense. And then they used, in New York, on those apartment buildings, you could only raise the rent by the amount that you spent to renovate them. So that padded all the renovations by 20%, and they used the bigger number to get a bigger rent increase than what they were entitled to, which would invoke a whole bunch of other different laws. But yes, he cheated repeatedly in these sorts of things, but also he is a very unique taxpayer in that he has these businesses that he runs, right, that often run big losses and require infusions of cash. The tax system's not really meant to try to put the brakes on that. That's sort of like Darwinism, right? Eventually, you're going to run out of cash. But he has this other stuff that's coming in from fame, from The Apprentice, from licensing deals, and from his father that arrives without any expenses at all. And if he had been taxed on that, he would have been paying massive amounts. But he can use that money to paper over the losses in the other and keep the whole thing afloat and stay rich. And then the losses wipe out all the taxes on some years $50 million from The Apprentice and licensing deals in 1 year in 2011, $400 million over about 15 years, and he paid virtually no taxes during that period at all because he had so many businesses that were recording losses. A lot of people will talk about depreciation. If you're a commercial property owner here, you're familiar with depreciation. The amount of money you spend to buy a building, you can write that cost off over a number of years. That's not what we're talking about here. Donald Trump actually has very little depreciation because he doesn't really the buildings that he built were condos, so he sold them off, and he doesn't really own much real estate there. But the tax, and then another aspect of it that I'll just say briefly is just partnerships. Partnership tax law is sort of a black hole in America. I've talked to several former auditors who would say the IRS has never really figured out how to audit partnerships in a meaningful way. Donald Trump's tax returns show 500 partnerships. Some years he's filing tax returns for 200, 300, 400 of those things, which created a great challenge for us. But like they just don't get audited. If they audit one partnership, that's extraordinarily rare. And when they do, they just say, we think you underpaid by like $10 million, and the taxpayer can generally say, well, we'll give you $5 million, and the IRS thinks it's a win. We got $5 million, and they walk away.
I think there's too a lesson to learn about the IRS in this, and it's that, if you go after a Donald Trump, it's very complicated, and you might just end up shrinking his net operating loss. So you're not actually going to get money at the end of the day. But if you target a W-2, a salaried employee, and you go after them, there's actually money that you're going to get, and that's sort of what the IRS wants. They want to get a check at the end of the day, and it's just, especially with the resources they have, it's just a lot easier to audit people who are not making a huge amount, but they're salaried employees that work for a corporation.
When he was running for the first time in 2016, his reason for not releasing his tax returns was that he was under audit. What has happened to that audit? It's been 9 years. Is that still going on? Or?
We're working on that. But
Okay, all right. Sorry, I'm not trying to give anything away.
No, I mean, that audit has had an incredible life, and it had his casinos in it at one point because he received that refund in 1 year, which was based on casino losses. He had briefly paid income tax on income from the Apprentice, and then he had this massive loss, and there was a special bill in relation to the 2008 collapse, and that allowed him to get a refund on everything he had paid on that Apprentice money for the prior years, but that's been under audit since. And then the Chicago Tower, the worthlessness declaration has been under audit, and the taxpayer really has a lot of advantages to drag that out, and he's benefited from that.
And just as an asterisk too, he could have released his taxes.
I mean, we just spoke to him I did a story on the Chicago Tower in May, and they acknowledged that audit was still ongoing at that point.
Amazing. Okay, so this book, you style this book in a lot of ways as an expose of all the things we're talking about, his business and financial shenanigans and so on. But it's actually also a really interesting book about him and his father, right? And of course, fathers and sons are the source of numerous literary and historical narratives over the years. But his father and his relationship is so fascinating. Fred Trump, of course, is a self-made developer. He actually did build things, and he did things that were along the margin, which you write about as well. But he willingly takes a back seat to Donald, who then, as you say, appropriates his fortune, appropriates his name, appropriates his financial officer, appropriates his credibility with the banks, to do all these things that Fred would never have done. In fact, Donald once said, my father, he could never do something like this in a very scornful way of his own dad. So what is this relationship like?
That quote was so great because he said it about he said it to somebody about a project that Donald Trump never actually finished.
Of course.
So it was but what is it with him and his dad? I mean, you can never fully, I think, get inside a relationship between a father and a son. But Fred Trump was he was a fascinating character. And I think one of the strongest traits that stands out to me was how much he wanted an heir. He wanted somebody to take over what he considered this family business, privately held. He wanted somebody who could run with it. And his firstborn son and namesake was Fred Trump Jr., who is I think a really rich character in the book and a really tragic character. He's obviously the eldest, and I think for a while was seen as possibly an heir in high school. And this is the level that we're talking, the age that we're talking, where Fred Trump was looking at his boys and their potential. Fred Trump Jr., his son, had other interests. It's not to say that he wouldn't have taken over the business, but he had other passions. He wanted to fly, and I think there was just a lot of internal conflict about him inside of him about what he wanted to do. And Fred Trump saw that as just a weakness. And Fred Trump Jr. fairly quickly just was written off, and he started drinking. We have just really sad scenes about him waking up in the morning, and he starts with a vodka and orange juice, and he drank himself to death. And the next person in line for Fred, he just had no time now for his first son, was Donald. And Donald was the man. I think he was chosen before even Robert, the next son, was probably 15. And I think that really drove him. And I think once he'd made the decision, he just doubled down on him. And we would talk to people who saw Donald and Fred, his father, together. And this person also knew other developers at the time, and they had sons. And the person said to us, what was so remarkable, and he remembered it to this day, was how hard those men were on their sons, and nothing was ever good enough. And he would run into Fred, and Fred would say, well, how about my Donnie? Isn't he the best? And Fred just backed him, and he was, Donald became a black hole for his money. He did so many things that Fred just, you couldn't even imagine Fred sleeping at night. He took on so much debt, and just the way he was sort of the antithesis of Fred, but Fred never seemed to waver.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing. I think that that it also set, a lot of people have said Fred Trump was a really tough guy, and maybe Donald's reacting to having a father who didn't love him. But what we see in every era of their relationship is just this unending, limitless support. And he just willingly takes a back seat to Donald, allows Donald to disparage him, continues to support him. There's one little period where when Donald's in his darkest hour in 1990 and tries to get complete control of the estate, Fred quietly shuts that down by having Donald's sister, who's a lawyer, intervene with the lawyers and make sure that doesn't happen. But he doesn't confront Donald about it directly and never holds it against him. So what it comes to feel like, ends up feeling like to us, is that really set his clock, his definition for what loyalty is. He expects to not be challenged on anything, and he wound up demanding that from all of his employees increasingly over the years. And you wrote about that brilliantly in the White House too, in the Divider. Like that's just a huge part of who he is, and it just feels like that's what love to him means. You love me.
And that scene that Russ talks about, there's a scene where Donald Trump, he's at one of his low points, and he sends lawyers over to try and get Fred, who is by that point getting old and on in life. He tries to change his will. And we learn about that through depositions that we got a hold of that were part of the litigation that Mary Trump went through with her family. And it was just, when we were reading it, like my hair on my arms were just standing on end, reading that part of it and what Donald did, that he was so craven that he would try and change the will to his favor. And, family interceded, and he was caught. And Marianne, his sister, was involved, and new lawyers were hired. But that scene was just really, to me, a window into a man's soul.
Well, we're going to open up it for questions in just a minute, but I want to ask about the process of writing the book. Tell me, what did you do for research? What did you find most helpful in terms of interviews, papers, documents that you didn't have already for the newspaper? What was the biggest aha moment when you said, other than coming up with that great title, when you said, wow,
it's all downhill from
this.
there.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm not sure there was one. I mean, I think first it was just overwhelming because we really wanted to tell this story not as like a series of newspaper articles, but it really increasingly just felt like a singular American story that spanned this huge period of time and had a succession battle at its heart and all that. So trying to find people of each era was difficult. Sue really took the lead on the bulk of the interviews. And I think when you worked really hard on The Apprentice, and when Sue got the financial records for The Apprentice, which was how much money each sponsor was paying, Donald got half of what they call product integration money. But this wasn't product integration. This was a show that was built around products. So like they introduced a toothpaste one time, and the toothpaste company paid $2 million for that episode. So you see that list and you realize he's not doing anything for that money, which is a really fun story for us to tell. But he's really getting rich just showing up every week. So.
Russ always used to say when we were talking early on, we have the skeleton of a book. After all the work we had done at the times, we still really only had a skeleton. And what we tried to do was get fresh anecdotes throughout. And I was surprised as we started on it. There's so much known about this guy. He's the most well-known person in the world. Like this was a crushing idea that could we do it? But so many people hadn't gone back and mined the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s and even The Apprentice. I can talk about one source in particular. He was great, and he's on the record, and it involved The Apprentice. I called Dan Gill. He was a producer on The Apprentice, and he was on the business side. And I phoned him up one day very early on and started talking to him, and no reporter had ever called him. And we got chatting, and he is, I don't want to call him a hoarder, but he is very organized.
We love hoarders.
Yeah, we love hoarders. So, but it has maybe negative connotations. This guy had so much information, and he had a storage locker with all the documents that he had ever touched from The Apprentice. And I would say, sometimes I would call him. So first of all, I went out to meet him, and I got a ton of information, including, we had the tax return information, so we understood how much money was made from The Apprentice, but to see how much money each company was paying. And then he also had emails where he would have I think Genworth was one of the companies that paid $4 million. And he has emails that show, so Donald Trump's getting $2 million of that. And Genworth wanted, they're a corporation, they wanted to have a voicemail blast that they could send to all their employees. And they wanted to have Donald Trump say, we're fired up about tonight's episode. And Donald Trump asked for more money to make that voice recording. And Dan had emails. So we had a lot of kind of narrators in each part of the book. But it was really refreshing just to see. I was glad that so many people hadn't been called. And then people had kept photos and other, just a lot of documents that we were able to get a hold of, as well as just calling people and getting their stories.
Those sound like some pretty great aha moments, honestly. Now, we're going to have questions here. What is it like writing it together? I've written a few books alone. I've written a few with my wife, and we are still married. But I also know, therefore, that it's not necessarily easy. How did you divide it up? And are you still friends? And will you do another one together? And...
We have to kill you if we tell you this. So we have a therapist out in the audience. But...
Okay, I mean, it's hard, right? It's a big job, and we were overwhelmed, and neither of us had done it before. So we just kind of decided early on that Sue was going to take the lead on the interviews, which was a monumental undertaking, and that I was going to do the structure and writing part of it, and we just tried to make it work. And it takes incredible generosity on Sue's part, to let that happen. And I love to report, so it was hard for me to not say, I want all those documents now, give them to me. But you have to divide and conquer, or we would just never gotten through this. And I think it was the interesting part to me was just what a journey it was for us. I mean, when we started this, I really had almost no confidence that I could do what Sue had asked me to do, that we could make this happen. It's much different than writing a newspaper article, even a 10,000 word newspaper article. And then over the course of that, there was an aha moment for me, was like, we were going to turn in about 40,000 words. And I was like, I don't know if I'm doing this the way anybody else would say is good, but this is the way I like it. I feel good about that. And that was like a really kind of peak moment, and then that carried through.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You have to believe in it yourself, otherwise nobody else will.
Yeah. Right, and I'd heard stories before we started on this about people writing books together, and have one author write one chapter and one author write another chapter, and we wanted to write a sweeping narrative, and it had to be cohesive. So I think we at the outset made really hard decisions. I like to write, Russ likes to report, but we had to really make a hard decision on it, and I think it worked. So I'm
it's a
glad,
great
I'm
book,
glad
of
we
course
did it,
it
but it
would.
was a
It
long
absolutely
2 or
would.
3 years.
For sure, absolutely. Let's have some questions here. The harder, the better.
Well, this may be hard or easy. I've heard bits and pieces. It's on?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
I've heard bits and pieces of this book on, I'm sure, NPR and a couple of other places, and I thank you for taking this project on. And should you do a sequel, or should it have had a subtitle, perhaps the lowest, a new low in chutzpah or something on the it's strange that we're so fascinated by this character. What I can't ever understand is why so many millions and millions of my fellow Americans can't let this information in, any of it, even the 6 bankruptcies. I hear all these interviews, why you support him, and it's often, very often, great businessman, and, that's your work. Do you have anything to add to it? Because I really don't understand it.
That's a tough one. I mean, yeah.
I've only been doing this on him for about 10 years, and I have no clue. But I part of it is, I think it's a lot of themes we try to get into this book. First of all, he has this singular kind of charisma, right, that repugnates a lot of people, but really it charms others. And there are scenes in the book where when he would get down, I think this goes to how he experiences love as well. When he would get down, when he was having a moment where the businesses weren't doing well and a project wasn't going well, he would take this, like, a thing that, like, some of his friends called, like, the walk of fame, from one project on Fifth Avenue to another. He only had 2, but it was like 2 blocks. And he would walk that way knowing that people were going to come up to him and go, "Oh my God, it's Donald Trump." And they would touch his coat like he was like some kind of Blarney Stone in a pinstripes, right? And it would just, by the time he got back, 15 minutes of that, he was renewed again. When he opened his casinos, there were like scores of women just fawning over him, like, "Donald, Donald, Donald," screaming. The clips from the Atlantic City Press from that thing are just amazing. So he's always had that. And again, I think that other thing that we just don't do well at, like, challenging rich people on what they say. And he just floods the zone. There's just you've seen him now. We've all seen this, right? And this plays out throughout the course of his life in this book, this flood of untruths. And he will just drown out any kind of contrary information. And he's completely shameless. I've never known anybody else. Like, if I knew you knew I was lying about something, I would shake and sweat. And most politicians I know would try to dance around it. They try to construct a logical path to get their point across, but he'll just tell you the sky's green, and you can go out and look for yourself. It's green, and you just keep saying it.
We've got a long line of questions, so let's try to see if we can get through a few more.
Thank you so much for covering this. You mentioned Wayne Barrett, who I read the first time in high school, and I was a huge fan of his, and he covered not just Donald Trump, but Rudy, and he said he was a detective for the people, which I think is great.
What?
A detective for the people.
Yeah.
And I think you both live up to that, and you deserve a lot of credit for that. My question is, with all this coverage of Donald Trump, there are lots of other people who are corrupt and doing bad things. Do you think they don't get covered as much because he sucks all the oxygen out?
Yeah, I mean, just the resources are finite, so I do. And sometimes I covered the number of the trials. I was down at there's been so many, hard to keep track, but I covered a number of the trials, and sometimes I was hurt just to see the resources that were there, the hundreds of people just sitting outside manning the cameras, the people in the courtroom. As an investigative reporter, you want to look where nobody else is. When everything is there, you should be over there. And it was upsetting, and just there was so many resources, be it journalistic resources or money going into security for these things. But I definitely think so. There's no question that we could, and hopefully we will be soon, looking at under other rocks.
Yeah, we can never keep up with you have to pick your battles. But thank you for mentioning Wayne. I knew
question.
Wayne, and he was a wonderful guy. Yeah.
This will probably show my ignorance about the media and fame and everything else, but I can't understand why he hasn't tried to repeat the success of The Apprentice in some way with another show or Apprentice 2 or something? What's the
I think that might be
a
called
lack
his
of
first
ideas
term.
about what he might do,
Yeah. But he's been busy since he left the Apprentice. But it's interesting what happened, and our book sort of leaves off right as he's heading into the White House. NBC dumped him because of the remarks he made when he announced his candidacy against immigrants, and he's had trouble getting licensing deals. They were already on a downswing, and a lot of people walked away from him. But I think if he doesn't win this time, I would hazard a guess, you never know, that he's going to try and find a home somewhere, and his family will.
But you should also, he didn't make The Apprentice happen. No. He was along for the ride on that. Right. He was one of the most revolutionary television producers of the last 50 years. Came to him, picked him out of obscurity, and made him into what you saw in there. And he just showed up every week and played a version of himself that they made into something else.
Well, I mean, even if it's not Donald himself that made the success, the folks who did make the success presumably made a lot of money out of it as well.
Right.
They did.
Why they wouldn't want to team up?
I really think he's kind of soiled his mass marketability now. He's gone from a couple of data points for me are the year before The Apprentice, he tried to get licensing deals, and his representatives literally got laughed out of offices. Then The Apprentice came on, and suddenly they made him marketable. Gallup found for the first time his approval rating was over 50%. He was making all kinds of licensing deals. Donald Trump Jr. that year decided to score on it himself and did a mock proposal to his wife in a jewelry store in New Jersey, right? Which most of the world found to be a little crass, but Donald was irritated because he didn't think Don Jr. got enough money for it. That was his grief, right? And so he's gone from that, and then some years, like I said, making $50 million from these things, to where now he's got Barron, his youngest son, in league with this new crypto business where they have a guy who basically describes himself as sort of the king of piss and poo. He's literally said on YouTube videos, you can sell excrement and urine and make millions of dollars. And that's who Barron is now in business with for his first thing out of this. I think that kind of captures the arc of his mass marketability.
Yeah, he's no longer a high-end brand. He's a political brand. Yeah, and a questionable one at that.
Hi. In all these years of studying and scrubbing and reading and listening and talking to people, have you ever discovered or uncovered anything sympathetic that is caught in his character? And I ask that because even the villains in Shakespeare, there are places where
that's a good
you
question.
can love them a little bit.
No, I know, and these things do turn into kind of really giant rag sessions, don't they? But so here's two things. There are a lot of people you talk to, including some friends of ours, who will say he can talk to you and make you feel like you're the only person in the room. That he really knows how to do that when he turns it on. If you cross him, it's all over. But he really can do that, and not just to, the people we want to think are ill-informed and don't like him. To smart, accomplished people, including our great colleague Charlie Bagley, has felt that way with him. So I think that's a thing. And also, a lot of people we talk to who used to work for him are still endeared to him because he hired them to a job that was far greater than anything they had done before. That was a sort of a control thing for him also, but they remain grateful for that opportunity if they were able to, win his favor and keep doing it. And so those are two categories of people you will find that still think well of him. Yeah.
The gentleman in front of me said he had a one sentence question. I said that's going to be a hard act to follow. Donald Trump he's a lucky loser, but he did win the biggest prize of all out there, so it's hard to say that. I'm going to go back to, I'm a tax economist, and I loved your series about 2018 when the $1 billion losses came out.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of valuations of properties that were really high in the market. He valued them really low. IRS would just move them up a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's not cheating. That's the way our law works. So I'm wondering, for all the work you've done in the tax area, is there a way to change this so that it seems more fair, or to stop this? It's tax avoidance, but it seems unfair.
Right. Yeah. What do you think, Russ? I mean, it's a hard question. Maybe throw that to the IRS.
We have to be in charge of the U.S. tax code.
That's
Now, I mean, I really think valuations are taxed on for property tax generally. You don't generally tax value as a part of the income tax system, right? And how we value, one unique thing about Donald Trump that separates it from other businesses I'm aware of is that there's a cap rate for commercial property, right? You figure out how much revenue there is, how much expenses there are, what's left over, and then you divide that by some number to come up with the value of the property. Everybody argues over what's the right cap rate, what's the right multiplier figure. Donald Trump messes with the numbers, and that's what that lawsuit was about, both with the banks, and I think there's a good basis for a property tax issue there as well. So that's very different, and I think you have to. That's just enforcing laws as they are. But I really think there are two big things: the way we tax partnerships, where it all flows through to one person, and then the IRS never looks at it holistically. Like a corporation's entire books get audited, right? For partnerships, they'll take one corporation, and it came out in the stuff that was released by Congress that the IRS said they were looking for basically one silver bullet, one entity they could tax that would have the ability to move him from the negative into the positive. And I'll just tell you, there is no one entity that could do that. You have to look at the whole thing holistically, and they were unwilling to undertake that. So they have to be able to undertake that. And then also the way we tax money that flows down to other generations. There's this thing that happens where, like, if it's worth whatever, it's just absurdly beneficial to other generations, and we have to kind of look at that in a meaningful way.
It's worth remembering that he promised, and when we first ran for president and people talked about this, he said, I'm the one who's going to be able to fix that tax system because I know how to manipulate it, right? And therefore I know how to close all those loopholes and make things fairer, and of course he never did.
Never did, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for being investigative reporters, and we need people like you so much, especially in this current climate. I wanted to just think about if somebody wrote a novel about this person, no one would believe it. Seriously, no one would believe this. It just occurred to me. But my question is this.
Speak up a little bit.
I'm sorry. Quite a few years ago, I read an article
That's better, yes.
in the Atlantic,
Yeah.
and it exposed Donald Trump's false narrative about his billions, and I kept looking for like articles as the years went by, and there weren't any. There just weren't any. And it brings me to what we're looking at right now, which is the current campaign. And last year, or even this year, I'm looking for good mainstream media to say, that was great, but that's an alternative fact in print and, of course, on TV and in other outlets. And I'm still not really finding it. And it's disturbing to me. Because I look for it. After that article, I really look for it, and it just doesn't seem to be there.
I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, you think about the debates and just trying to even live fact check those. I mean, it's frustrating to hear the lies flow out, and the option they have is to keep interrupting the debate, and then it just devolves into a mess. So they've decided in some cases not to, and they leave it up to, I know our paper does a live blog where we try to fact check it at the side.
Right.
When the lies are coming as fast as they are in real time, it's hard. And that's why, people like Russ and I go back and we try to understand. When we went back to the 70s and the 80s, it was just incredible how much stuff even you thought was real, you thought was a fact that wasn't. It was just, we would find where it started. He would say something and it would just be said over and over, and then all of a sudden it's a fact. It's a tough job to do it, but I hear you on it.
I think we have the easier side of that because we just come in once a year with some giant new truth, right? Peter has the tougher job. He has to wrestle with those issues every day, and it's beyond me. So I'm happy Peter's doing it.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask, first of all, the best thing I've heard today is to hear you guys say you're looking under a few more rocks. That is great. But I wanted to bring up Alan Weisselberg, and is he just kind of a dead issue and there's nothing going to be coming for it? Could he be forced, aside from going to prison, to come up with more validity about what he participated in terms of the finances?
I don't think you're going to see it. I think you've seen his willingness to now go to prison twice.
Yeah.
And he's just not going to flip on the family. He's very close to them. In addition, he's participated in a lot of the tax schemes. And I thought at one point there might have been some movement. I know prosecutors were sort of threatening him over an issue that they saw where he made false statements involving an insurance claim. I don't see it happening.
Okay.
I think it's just, yeah.
And then I was just hopeful. And the next, by my count, it's 65 lawsuits. Are there more?
By the way, I don't have. Do you have that spreadsheet?
Oh, that's
Oh, okay.
Can we see your work on that, please? Sounds good.
He's lost, if it's 65, he's lost 64.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's not turning the tide. That's why,
But I think what's important to remember about the lawsuits, I don't think for him it's about the win. It's about tying people up in litigation and draining their money.
Playing
And that's
his
what he
game.
does over and over. And we talk about it in the book about contractors. There were small business people who he owed money to, and they would take 10, 20 cents on the dollar because their option was to go to court. And you see it now and other things. He just wants to tie people up in litigation. If he loses, he doesn't care.
keep going.
Can I just ask a quick question? Does everybody here know who Alan Weisselberg is?
He's the CFO.
That's just incredible, isn't it? It's like,
These are Politics and
This
Prose.
is where we
This
are.
the Politics and Prose audience here. This is the top.
Well, this is
Uh-oh,
not your average crowd. I just have one simple question. This guy is an entrepreneurial genius when it comes to grifting, which I cover. He is. He just is good at grifting. How much money does this son of a bitch have, actually? I would like to know how much money does he actually have, profit loss? Can you figure it out?
no. The best window we've had, this is the great Kara Swisher, by the way, who's asking you this question. Tax returns don't really enable you to do that. We could tell the stocks that he held or the stocks that he sold at different times, and
Right.
it's fluctuated a lot, but it's always a moving thing because he has businesses. It's not like where he has businesses that are just doing okay and then some that are making a lot. He has ones that are really sucking money and ones that are just floating, and then he has like income from things that are not businesses at all. All these licensing deals have no expenses. It's just pure cash, and the only expense on the tax return is like $150 for filing a tax return. So it's a really hard
Can you
thing.
give
But
an estimate of what he's actually worth if you had a third party?
well, I mean,
guess?
there's the hard assets, right? His best asset is the one he never wanted and tried to get out of, and that's 2 commercial buildings, one in New York City and one in San Francisco, that's run by another company, Vornado Real Estate Trust. And they're a real estate company that was created and run by a contemporary of Donald Trump. So I think he would like to be Steve Roth, but he's not. And that's alone is probably worth, it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I think chiefly because he has nothing to do with the operation of it.
Mm-hmm.
The total value of his other things, golf courses, are really hard to value. It's not a high profit business. The buildings that he does own have really been up and down over the years. So I think that's a hard number. And I don't think he has as much cash on hand enough to pay these possible judgments.
I think also, and it was surprising in our journey through all this information that it was just when you would find like he's sending 10 or 20 million dollars overseas to a golf course to plug a hole because it needs work. And we saw that over and over, and it was sort of unexpected. Doral has eaten up a lot of his money. All his assets that he does own, these golf courses, they're losing money, most of them.
Shell game is
And
what you're
they
saying.
well, it's a shell game. They're real, but they lose money, and then he has to pay money just to keep for upkeep. And so it was sort of, and then we also don't know, we mentioned the audit. We believe it's ongoing, but he's got to write, if that goes against him, he's got to write a check. In New York State, he's facing upward of $450 million fine on that civil case if that is upheld on appeal.
So are you guys looking into the crypto thing, which is I know that guy. It's bad. I mean, in crypto, he's the lowest rung of the thing, and it's a very low bar to start with. So you're looking into their crypto business and then DJT.
Sure, we'll start on Tuesday.
Okay.
That's a good idea. That's a good
There's a
idea.
lot to look at those two things, which are worth a lot.
Yeah, no. Carol, the way like I've thought about this, how do you figure out? It's unrewarding to try to figure out what the total value of everything, the hard assets, and his cash goes up and down every year. But the way I've thought of it is if it's a line from the epilogue. If he would have invested the money he received from his father and from the Apprentice just in the stock market, bet on the stock market instead of himself, he would definitely be a multi-billionaire, like probably 3 or 4 times over, right?
Yeah.
And he doesn't have that.
Yeah,
No, it's
don't
not
let us
close.
get it started on J.D. Vance's financial history. But anyway.
All right. Listen, guys, thank you very much for coming. Thank you guys for such a fabulous book. They've done all the hard work. Make sure to buy lots of copies.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.